All right, hopefully you can all see my screen and hopefully you're in the right place, as they say when you get on an airplane these days. If you're hoping to get to Pittsburgh tonight, we're not going to get you there. But if you're interested in instant runoff ranked choice voting, 101, the basics, and maybe a little bit more, you're in the right place. What is it and how can it hit? How can it help? We, of course, are hosted by Better Ballot Georgia, common sense solutions for a healthy democracy. So I already asked you this, but if you haven't already answered this question, what frustrations do you have with the elections in Georgia? Tell us in the chat. We want to know why you're here, because I suppose unless there's something that you want to make better, you wouldn't have a good reason for being here to begin with. So just in case you don't know, and I think many of you don't, Better Ballot Georgia is a new organization. We were actually started in the summer of 2020, but we didn't officially have our launch until November. So we're brand new. We are a nonpartisan educational organization. There are nobody is on payroll here, 100% volunteer run, and we're focusing, as you can see, on education to work collectively to fix what's broken in our election processes. And of course, tonight, our focus is going to be on instant runoff ranked choice voting. What you see right now is taken right out of our bylaws. Okay, so as you can see, we have applied for 501c3 status as a nonprofit organization. We hope to have that soon, but we are not yet. We're not going to make any solicitations tonight, but should you ever decide to donate to us, at this point, we can't guarantee that it'll be tax deductible. In the future, we know that it will be. Well, we're pretty much assumed it will be once we get that designation. We have already, though, accumulated over $10,000, all from private individuals with an average donation you can see here of over $130. We have volunteers and donors that come from every part of the political spectrum. We have been advised in our journey so far by a national organization called Rank the Vote that helps states organize all across the country. And I think we do have a representative here from Rank the Vote who will be listening in. And but they've been very helpful in helping us get going here. So who am I? I am Shai Ropkin. I am the president of the board of Better Ballot Georgia. And just to let you know, I have this strange name for those of you who don't know, Shai. It's an Israeli name, which means in Hebrew, it means gift, or as my wife would prefer, souvenir. But that I might share a little bit later about how I got into this journey. But what's more important is to talk about why you're here and what are we trying to solve. What we can't deal with the solution until we deal with what are the problems, and maybe there's some others. Now, let me just mention right now before we get going, when you have questions or if you have comments, go ahead and put them in the chat right now. Whenever you see them, you have something, go ahead and put them in. I hope we'll have some time to deal with some of those comments and questions tonight, but, and I'll mention this again later, our next month's meeting, we're going to dedicate to a whole Q&A, and it will be not just representatives from here in Georgia, but for some of the national organizations dealing with ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting. So we'll collect all those questions and really dig deep and actually have an opportunity for some real conversations. So what are those key questions? What are those key problems? Well, first and foremost, as you can see, limited choices that don't reflect actual voter preferences, vote splitting and strategic voting, negativity and hyperpartisanship, non-mandate, non-majority winners, costly, time-consuming, and undemocratic runoffs. I went through those quickly because I'm going to go into those in more detail as we move forward. I do want to point out, though, we can't, and I won't, pretend to tell you that instant runoff ranked choice voting will solve all those issues that were just mentioned, because there's other issues. One being ballot access, meaning in particular, we're talking about here in Georgia, it's not so easy to get on the ballot right here. And of course, if you can't get on the ballot, it's pretty much it's difficult for anybody to vote for you, regardless of the system where you're voting. And we also have our partisan primary elections, which also makes that difficult. So that I wish I could tell you that if we instituted instant runoff voting here in Georgia, it would immediately solve those. We believe it takes us a big step forward, but there may be other things that have to be addressed, and we don't pretend to say that they don't need to be. So what is the impact of that election structure? Well, first of all, we need to separate the elections we have in Georgia. Our presidential elections are conducted quite differently than other elections. And here's where ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting really is needed in Georgia, because we don't have it at all. For presidential elections, be they the primaries or the general elections, we have plurality winners. Right? You can win with 30% of the vote, as long as everybody else got fewer than you do. And you can see in this case, the red candidate wins with 32% of the votes. 68% of the votes were for other candidates. And yet, if you look, for example, at how the Electoral College works, and we're not here to talk about the Electoral College, you may have an opinion of whether it's good or whether it's bad. But one thing I think we should all agree in is whoever gets those Electoral College votes, to the extent that one candidate's going to get all those votes, and that's the way it is in Georgia right now, that winner should at least get a majority of the votes. It should not just be a plurality, meaning less than 50%. They should get a majority, at least 50% plus one. So that plurality voting that we do have in Georgia and other places, by the way, other states in the country where they have the kind of runoffs they have here, they actually elect all sorts of people or all sorts of representatives, congressional elections, Senate elections, strictly Black plurality. But when you have that situation, and here in Georgia, it would apply to our presidential primaries and general elections, we have strategic voting, where you don't necessarily vote for who you really like. You vote for your second and third choice because your real favorite is unlikely to win. And as I mentioned before, because of limited voter access, or limited ballot access, and partisan primaries, it's very difficult for third parties or independent candidates to get on the ballot altogether. And sometimes they don't even bother to try. So our choices get limited very naturally. So choice is a big thing, and we'd like to get rid of that. Now, we are totally nonpartisan here, but I think a nonpartisan statement could say that there were, not necessarily you, there were a lot of folks who were not particularly pleased with the candidates in our recent presidential election. But the question we have to honestly ask ourselves is, what realistic choice did anybody have if they really did not look favorably upon either Donald Trump or Joe Biden? Maybe some of you voted for the Libertarian who was on the ballot. That was Joe Jorgensen. But if you were a favorite, if you liked the Libertarian candidate, did you vote for her or did you not because you want to relinquish your vote? And by the way, I should also, if you didn't vote for the Libertarian, how do you feel about those people who did? Do you think that, wow, these idiots, they just wasted their vote? Did you think differently? Well, that fear of spoilers looms large. Let's take a little bit of a further step back in history, which will really demonstrate that this can go both ways. This doesn't work necessarily for Democrats, doesn't work for Republicans. 1992, I think many of you can remember that, where one of the strongest third-party candidates we've ever had in America, Ross Perot, got almost 20% of the vote. Bill Clinton, on the national popular vote, became president with only 43%. Now, there are many people who believe that those folks who voted for Ross Perot, if they were given a second choice where they could indicate their preferences, which they could have done with ranked choice voting, the majority of those votes would have gone not for Clinton, they would have gone for Bush. And who knows, obviously you have the Electoral College to deal with. It could have been that Bush would have been elected. But hey, year 2000, tables get flipped, all right? Where we had a third-party candidate, particularly, you remember that election in Florida where Ralph Nader was particularly strong. We can deal with that one state. And people are pretty well convinced that if there was a second choice for Nader voters, they most certainly would have gone to Al Gore. And Al Gore would have been the president who was elected in 2000. It cuts both ways. Sometimes it may work for Democrats, sometimes it may work for Republicans. It's just the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do. Right, ranked choice voting. So we're left as sort of what I have described up to this point with a ballot that often looks like this. At the top, there's someone I like. At the bottom, there's, well, apocalypse now, someone I detest, God forbid. So what do? You don't vote for the someone I like because you don't think that someone I like has a chance of really winning. So you engage in strategic voting. You vote for the lesser of the evils. That's a shame if that's what you're forced into doing. And of course, this gets worse. The more candidates you have on a ballot and in primaries, wow, we've seen it and with the Democrats in 2020, we saw it in 2016 with the Republicans, a whole host of candidates. And of course, in most states, including Georgia, all you had to do was to win a plurality, right, to get all the delegates to the convention. And I should note here that in Georgia, primary elections are administered by the government, not the individual parties. The parties can't decide to do it any differently because it is the state of Georgia that determines how they're going to be conducted. So, if I may, and I would just want to point out here that this is only for demonstrative purposes only, but this may be fresh in people's minds. We had a very unusual situation, of course, in Georgia. We had two Senate elections taking place at the same time. That's not supposed to happen and under normal circumstances. One was that regular election between primarily the Democrat John Ossoff and the Republican Mr. Perdue. But we also had this special election where there are a whole host of candidates. Now, Raphael Warnock, who is currently the senator, a lot of people may have assumed that, wow, it was clear that he was going to be the favorite of the Democrats. Well, 6 months ago in September, or certainly not this summer, but that wasn't the case. If you look back at the polling from this summer, it wasn't clear at all that Raphael Warnock was going to get into a runoff. Not at all. In fact, there were some other candidates, some of which you see here, that were leading in the polls. But what I want to point out here, which you can see the top 6 finishers in that general election. If you look at the Democrats, Warnock, Deborah Jackson, Matt Lieberman, and Tamara Johnson-Shealy, you combine all of those, they get collectively about 44% of the vote. If they were all split between them, they would have all ended up with 11%. And of course, what would that have done in Georgia? The runoff would not have been as it was between Kelly Loeffler and Raphael Warnock. It would have been between the two Republicans, Warnock and Loeffler. Raphael Warnock would have been out of the picture altogether. Therefore, there were a number of groups that said, hey, well, Democrats at least, that say, hey, faced with this prospect, we may need to give up on our favorite candidate. And I'm not trying to say anything disparaging about Raphael Warnock. In fact, right, that there were folks who were in favor, who actually ran ads in favor of Raphael Warnock, saying there are other good candidates, but you need to coalesce around just one. Now, something you may not be aware of that happens in primaries is a tremendous number of wasted votes that came as a result of candidates who dropped out before the actual date of the primary election took place. As you may recall, back in February of 2020, when Joe Biden emerged as a result of the primary in South Carolina as the clear frontrunner in the Democratic primary, and shortly thereafter, you had most of the Democratic candidates dropped just in a few days after. Well, when it came Super Tuesday, lots of people had voted early, but their votes went nowhere if they voted for any of those candidates who dropped out. There were over 4.5 million total wasted votes in the Democratic primary. With ranked choice voting, that probably would not have happened. And if you believe that early voting is a good thing to allow people to greater participate in our democratic process, then you really need ranked choice voting. And of course, when you can't vote for the candidate that you really like, why bother to vote at all? And that's what we see, lots of voter apathy. And of course, in addition to that, if you are going to vote, most of us, we find, this is what political scientists tell us, we decide on a candidate and we don't even bother to think about what the other candidates stand for or who they are. With ranked choice voting, we learn that the voters take the time to explore what other candidates, not necessarily their number one candidate, What do they have to say? Because they know that their favorite may not win, and they have to trick a second and a third, maybe a fourth and a fifth. So they're much more engaged. They're much more educated. And we basically have more voters, and we have more educated voters. And certainly we see this here in Georgia. We have runoffs which are very costly, and they're also undemocratic. All right, as you can see here, I took a picture from the north side neighborhood. I live in Fulton County. Now, Georgia has 159 counties. Every one of them had to spend a bunch of money to conduct runoff elections. In fact, in Georgia, we had two of them, one for the primaries, right? And then again for the general election. Fulton County, the largest county, alone spent $6.5 million. I can tell you, see later, the city of Johns Creek, when they have to run a city election, they have a runoff, it costs them about $140,000. Now, it's hard to collect all the data, but we know it costs tens of millions of dollars of taxpayer money, not to mention, well, people estimate about $500 million that the parties themselves or the candidates themselves spent. Just taxpayer money. Totally unnecessary. Here's an election that you're probably not familiar with. In fact, I can't even tell you what the public advocate of New York City does, but they had an election 8 years ago for the public advocate's position. It cost them $13 million to run that one runoff. And then I mentioned it's undemocratic. Well, you know what? We had a pretty good turnout for the runoff for our Senate election here in January, but it was far less. It was still about 500,000 votes fewer than voted in the general election. And you can see here, generally speaking, it's less than half of those people that vote in general elections. Serious drop off. How democratic is that? And how democratic is it when you have a total different set of voters voting in one election than another? When the election takes place at one time and one time only, which ranked choice instant runoff value allows to do, we don't have to deal with that problem. And probably something that may motivate, I didn't look at what the chat said, but I saw at least one or two things that talked about civility. The system as we have it today leads to a lot of negative campaigning, and of course, negativity between the voters as well, and hyper-partisanship. I probably don't have to tell you a whole lot about it, but you can see here, based on analysis was done on that Senate runoff election, about 70% of those ads were negative. They spent almost $500 million. Well, you probably saw them. If you're watching TV at all, you couldn't avoid them. Negativity, ranked choice voting, because candidates know that they can't just appeal to their base. They know that they have to be careful about who they piss off. They need to say to the voters, you may not like me as your number one, but think about me for your number two or your number three. And we have seen, it's been demonstrated already by those places that have ranked choice voting, it totally tones down the negativity in campaigns. Now, wouldn't it be nice, right, if we could look, for example, at our Senate of America today or our state legislature in Georgia today? Can't we just talk about things and reach compromises? Well, that would probably be true if our differences were just around issues and policies. Then perhaps we could. But researchers have told us that we're beyond debating issues. We're into what's totally called identity politics. Liliana Mason, a professor at the University of Maryland who wrote a book called Uncivil Agreement, writes the following. What if we hold relatively moderate issue positions, but we're so attached to our identities that we feel very distant from our outgroups, regardless of the issue content? So issue-based polarization basically means that we disagree, and the identity-based polarization means that we feel like we are very different people from the people on the other team, regardless of our actual issue agreements. Liliana Mason would go on to say, we've gotten to the point where all we care about is whether our team, our candidate, our party, whether they win, and we don't really care about what they do afterwards. It's all about winning and losing, and perhaps sticking it to the other team, seeing the other team suffer. That's identity politics. And when you've got to that point, there's very little you can do just to talk out the issues. So I want to talk a little bit about how I came, excuse me, let me just take a sip of water here. I spent my entire life in business. I actually had a business in Israel. I had 2 businesses here in the United States. And I look at everything through the lens of business. And I think if there's anything that businessmen in America, and I think we try to hold this up to the entire world, is that America, I guess the great beacon of capitalism, says, you know what? It works when there is open and fair competition. And we need to ask ourselves, if it works for business, shouldn't it work for politics? Where competitions, where all companies or parties or candidates operate on a level playing field with none of them having an unfair advantage. And you can see in the business rivals focus on price, quality, customer service. Well, in politics, hopefully they're going to be focusing on issues and character and the voters and their real needs, right? Not necessarily of appealing to some sort of identities, which have nothing to do with how business is conducted when legislators legislate. Now, I've been a businessman for a long time, but for the last dozen years, my focus in business and economics, and that is what I studied in college, and I did get a master's in business administration, is something called behavioral economics. And one of the key ideas of behavioral economics is the way people think and the way people behave is all a question of the environment in which their choices are made. You change the environment in which their choices are made, and you can change how they behave. You can change how they think. So I believe actually that Homer Simpson has a lot to teach us about this. So as you can see in this little cartoon here, right, as a great example of what's called choice architecture. Well, Homer is free to choose the donuts, sugar-coated, of course, or the healthy fruit. But where's the healthy fruit? Well, it's right at eye level on its countertop. If he wants to get the donuts, well, he's got to go behind the counter and pull them out of a special cabinet. So what does it mean here? It's all a question of how his choice was structured. And therefore, we have to say, or I have to say, how we elect our representatives determines in good measure how they legislate and govern. We can't separate how we choose them from how they will legislate and govern. And if you think to a great extent that our legislatures, whether they're nationally or in the state of Georgia, that they truly are not working on behalf of the voters, that they can't work together across the aisle, well, don't expect that to change unless we change the structure on how they got there in the first place. Choice architecture, it changes how you change the environment, it changes your decision. That's what's key. We shouldn't expect fair and open competition if choice architecture mitigates against it. Our elections can't be really fair if the way they're structured to begin with mitigates against that. Here's the good news. A simple tweak, and you know what's coming, and how we vote can make a big difference. What is that? You know it. Instant runoff, ranked choice voting. Now, I should point out at this point, if you look around the country and around the world for that matter, most folks refer to it as ranked choice voting, but it's also commonly referred to as instant runoff voting. Perhaps it has greater appeal here in Georgia because we in Georgia know what runoffs are all about, and perhaps for no other reason alone that we want to save our voters the hassle from going to the polls over and over again and the expense of the taxpayers, right? Say, hey, we're going to have runoffs. Let's just do it instantly. So that's maybe a better way to refer to it here in Georgia. It's simple. What is it? Well, you can see the little ballot here. In this case, it's just 3 candidates, a first, second. Decide which candidate you like the best. After that, decide who else you would prefer after that. right? And then select them. And you know what? Instant runoff or ranked choice voting is used all over the place. It's used in businesses. It's used in selecting representatives in college. It's used in all sorts of organizations. Right? We're going to choose our favorite food in just a second. You can do all sorts of things. This is not, people know what this is. They're using it all the time, but perhaps just not enough in the political process. Hey, so how does it work? Again, all you do is you tally the voters' first choices. After that, we ask ourselves this simple question. Do any of the candidates on the ballot have a majority? And of course, what is a majority? Again, that is 50% plus one vote. If they do, hooray, game over. We don't have to go any further. But if not, what will happen is we look at those candidates, we'll eliminate the last place candidate. And then, and I want to emphasize this, ballots for eliminated candidate count towards the voter's next choice. And what's important to emphasize here, we look, or the system looks, at every individual voter ballot. Every individual voter's ballot is looked at to see what that voter's next second choice is, who that voter's is. And it's going to be vary for every different voter. I mean, it could be some for same, but we're not collectively grouping them. It's every individual ballot is examined. And then we retally the vote. We do it again. Right? If there are only 3 candidates on the ballot, well, it's only going to have to be done once. But there could be many more, as we saw in that Georgia special election or many other like primary elections. It may go through multiple iterations, but eventually you're going to get a majority winner. It's really so simple that, well, let's look at a 1-minute video that I have shown to my 6-year-old grandson who says, I get it. And if he gets it, I know you will too.
Pick your favorite color.
The ranked choice voting way.
Instead of voting for just one color, you get to rank your top 3.
Well, purple is the best, but if I can't have purple, I want blue. And if neither of those wins, I guess I can live with orange.
Now, let's count up everybody's votes.
Under ranked choice voting rules, it's not enough just to get the most votes. You need a majority.
More than 50% of the votes.
Purple's ahead, but it has only 7 votes.
It needs at least 11 to win.
So we eliminate the color in last place.
Sorry, Orange fans, we're going to your second choice.
2 more for green.
1 for purple.
But no color has 11 votes yet.
Still no majority.
Bye-bye,
blue.
1 more for purple.
4 for green.
And we have a winner.
The ranked choice voting way.
So in that particular example, you notice that the ultimate winner was not in first place to begin with. But let's look now at a real world example from an election for mayor that took place in 2018 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And as you can see here, there were 5 candidates on the ballot. And of course, there was only one time that voters had to go to the polls. So when we talk about round 1, we're not talking about the times that people voted. We're talking about round 1 of counting the ballots. And as you can see here, in that first round, Alan Weber had 39.2% of the votes, right? Well short of 50% or 50 plus 1%. And all the way at the bottom, there was this gentleman named Peter Ives, who was the last place finisher. So in round 1, he gets eliminated. Now, what I really want to call your attention to is on round 2. And if you compare the votes in round 2 with all the 4 remaining candidates, you will see that every one of them had their increase in a number of votes. So for example, Alan Weber, right, went from 8,080 to 8,474. The second place candidate went from 5,026 to 5,241, etc. Every candidate increased their votes. Why? Because the voters who voted for Peter Ives had different opinions, different preferences as to their second choice. So they were distributed. Now, after that round 2 count, Joseph Mastis was eliminated. And the same thing happens again. But I do want to point out some of the folks who voted for Peter Ives, right, as their first preference, as you note, some of them went to Joseph Mastis in round 2. Well, what happened to that vote? Well, that's why it was important for those people who voted for Peter Ives to have a third choice, because then their votes could go to the other 3 candidates who were remaining, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, eventually in this case, Alan Weber, who started off as the leader, had a plurality to start with. He ends up with almost 2/3 of the vote. He ends up with a mandate. But at least we know that all things considered, he was the preferred candidate of the voters. He could never say that. He could never claim a mandate after if we just stopped at round 1 and knowing that 60+% of the voters wanted somebody else. So we have a mandate. So let's try it ourselves right now. Okay? We're going to do it in a non-political context. I want you to imagine for a second that you're involved with an organization. And of course, I have a very non-COVID picture of everybody holding hands at a retreat. But just imagine that for whatever reason, only one kind of fruit can be available for the entire weekend. 5 fruits are possibilities, but you got only going to settle on one. But we're going to let all the attendees vote using ranked choice voting to determine which one is going to be that one fruit that's going to be available. Now, if we were conducting this with a paper ballot, it would look like this. Okay, you can see apple, banana, grape, orange, pear. Those are going to be your 5 choices, right? But of course, in most cases, of course, here in Georgia, we're not using paper ballots. I may get printed afterwards. Right? We're using votes by machine. So what we're going to see right now is pretty much a simulation of what it might look like if you were voting on a ballot machine, on a voting machine, or if you were even voting from home. So here's that thing. But I am right now, I'm going to stop my share for just a second. And I'm going to put into the chat a place where you can go right now. All right, if you'll look in the chat right now, okay, you'll see something that says rank it, right, .vote, right? Go ahead and do that right now. It'll only take you a minute. All right, I may continue in just a minute. I want to make sure everybody can get there. Okay. And and Eric put in there a more clickable link. Thank you very much, as opposed to just copy and paste it. Thank you very much, Eric. You can see that. And go there, cast your vote. And right towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to keep you on the edge of your chairs. We'll give the big reveal about, well, the favorite fruit of this group, one way or the other. So go ahead and you can do that as I continue. But I'll give you one more minute to consider that. More important than the results is just to see one example of how really easy this really is. One example. Okay, you can continue doing that. Hopefully that shouldn't present a problem. It's really simple, 5 choices. And I should point out, there are some places that do limit how many places that you can, how many candidates you can vote for. There could be, for example, 20 people on the ballot, but very often there's some places like New York City that passed ranked choice voting in November 2019. They decided to limit it to just 5 candidates, which probably is the reason I decided on 5 fruits that you could choose from here tonight. Okay, continue, as I say, to put your questions into the chat as we move forward. If you haven't voted, continue to do that as well. As I'm going to go back and share my screen again. So let's look at those additional benefits of instant runoff ranked choice voting. Okay. As we just talked about, more choices, right? And because candidates have a chance, they get on the ballot, And if they're on the ballot, right, there's no spoiler effect. You can feel free to vote for them without worrying that you're going to actually end up with a candidate you don't want. We have true mandated winners, majority winners, more civil campaigns, less partisanship, greater voter turnout, more minority and women representatives, and no more costly runoffs. Let's look at these in a little more detail. Okay, as I showed you before this screen with Santa Fe, just want to show it to you again to emphasize the point. Well, Alan Weber, I could have claimed victory with a plurality, but at least we know he can claim a mandate. And I think that's important for being able to govern as well. Minneapolis has had, as actually St. Paul as well, has had ranked choice voting for a number of years. And as you can see here, the former Minneapolis mayor says there was relatively little elbowing and attacking because every candidate wanted to be the second choice of their opponent's supporters. Sometimes we've seen that candidates actually collaborate. Well, collaborate sounds like an ugly word, but let's say, hey, you know what? I may not be your first, but vote for me second. I don't see a whole lot wrong with that. To the extent that people are focused, that voters are focused on the issues, that's a good thing. And if there are candidates that can agree on issues and saying, well, look, you know what? I agree with candidate Y on the issues, but maybe you want to choose that candidate other than me. Well, choose me second, just in case your first choice doesn't make the cut. And we see here, based on research, that voters consistently report less negativity. And you can see it that it improves debating. Going back to Santa Fe, in 2018, 67% of the voters reported it was less negative. So there's been polling that was done and consistently shows less negativity. So we can analyze that not only by what the voters say, but we can also analyze text in debates. We can analyze it in advertising. Now, voter turnout. Now, this becomes even more true the more voters become familiar with ranked choice voting. But what we're looking at here very often is just the first turnout. So we can see here that this study that was done by the University of Missouri, St. Louis, right, 26 cities across 79 elections, 10-point increase in voter turnout compared to those primary and runoff elections. Right? So you remember, right, what a big decrease we get when we have a separate runoff. Now, not a lot of change in the turnout for the general election initially, but over time, what we found is that does increase as people discover that they can actually vote for candidates that they really like. Now, some people say, well, this is going to lead to voter errors. Well, it doesn't happen. Voters understand it, voters adjust to it, and voters like it. How much do voters like it? Well, you can see here, Maine, which is the leader across the country, and their very first statewide Democratic primary, 87% ranked multiple candidates. Now, I want you to note here, if you have more than two candidates there, you're not required to rank, right, more than that. Now, if there were, say, 5 candidates on the ballot, all right, those 5 fruits, maybe you hate pears. Now that you hopefully voted, I'm not going to try to skew the vote. Well, you're not required to vote for more than one. But here, what we see is 87% decided to rank, right, more than just one. That didn't just vote for that. And then we see in Santa Fe, they did the same thing. And then in that Santa Fe election you just saw, 61% ranked all 5 of them. People took the time to think about all the candidates. Isn't that a nice thing? Now, something that I don't know was necessarily anticipated, but maybe it should be. When you offer more real choices and you offer opportunities for people to get on a ballot realistically because they have a chance, well, perhaps candidates that have perhaps been locked out in the past can get on the ballot. So you can see here on city councils, before ranked choice voting, right, about half as many women, right, get elected as with a ranked choice voting option. What a difference. And then also people of color. We see a significant difference in the same way for the cities that adopted ranked choice voting. Big, big differences strictly because real options are now become available. So here's what you saw before, right? This simple diagram eliminates those costly runoffs. It eliminates them altogether. Millions of dollars in Georgia, which are both costly and undemocratic. So one of the better things about it is that, you know what, it's been tried and proven. So here's some folks that have done it. Now let's look at Utah. Well, it's got a purple background, but it's pretty much a red state, right? They're totally on board with ranked choice voting. And you can see here, Mark Roberts says, hey, I have a hard time accepting that someone get elected with less than 50% of the vote. New Mexico's Secretary of State, it stimulates voter participation. With more citizens participating, the healthier our democratic process is. Our mayor of Oakland, or the mayor of Oakland, right? They've discovered as a candidate, you have to talk to everybody, even the people who you know you're not their first choice. It changes the way you run campaigns. And by the way, discovered it actually just changes the way voters talk to each other, the way candidates talk to voters and the way voters talk to each other. So one of the most influential voters in America, he is a voter, but also voices, I was going to say. David Brooks, who writes for the New York Times, considered, maybe either a conservative, middle of the roader, right, has written a lot about ranked choice voting and believes it is one of the reforms to save America. But he's not alone. Just recently, Georgia State University adopted ranked choice voting to choose its student representatives. There are 90 plus candidates where the colleges have realized this is the way we should do it, because why would we do it any other way? Why we do it any other way? Nobel Prize winners in economics. I mentioned I come to this from a background in economics. And those folks who have studied this thing from an economics perspective, and economists study the science of choice. Right? And you can see from across the board, these Nobel Prize winners in economics who have endorsed ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting. And then, of course, the experts and political science, those who have won this special prize, which I'm not quite sure I know how to pronounce, but you can see across the board, and we have political scientists here in Georgia and many advocates right here in Georgia who are in favor. Ranked choice voting is on a roll throughout the country, indeed the world. It's happening. And because it's happening, one of the reasons it's happening is there's a number of organizations. We're better at Ballot Georgia here. And as I mentioned, as you can see right in the middle, we got a lot of help from an organization called Rank the Vote, which helps individual state organizations organize. But the other organizations you see here are all national organizations, all of which, sometimes it's exclusively working for ranked choice voting, in some case, it's part of their platform. There's a whole host of organizations that are advocating and working towards making this happen both in the states and across the country. And there's all sorts of organizations, nonpartisans, including last year, I think very significant, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which you can see here in the top right. They issued a whole lot of recommendations to make America democracy healthy. Ranked choice voting was among the top. In fact, I think it was number 2 on their list. But you can see here the American Political Science Association, the super smart people from Mensa, the American Psychological Association, all sorts of these organizations are saying, hey, if you're going to conduct an election, this is the way to do it. And you can see those professional organizations again here. So there's even more good news, okay? It's been used, it's tried and proven. This is not an experiment, folks, all right? Common sense instant runoff voting is on a roll. And the leader, of course, well, I say of course if you know it, is the state of Maine, which has adopted it statewide. In fact, this past fall, they conducted for the very first time presidential election right, using ranked choice voting. Actually, a Senate election, it actually didn't have to come into play because on the first round, there was a majority. But it's being used all across the country, as you can see, for mayors, city councils, and as you can see at the bottom, presidential primaries. Here's a quick map. I won't go into it. By the way, this slide set can be made available to you just by contacting us at admin@betterballotgeorgia.org. We'll provide you with that slide set. But you can see in different ways, whether it's primaries, special elections, right, even used for military and overseas balloting only. You can see, by the way, for surrounding states, that may happen in Georgia is the first thing. We'll see. I don't know. But this is not new. Presidential primary use. Okay. Very primary. You can see this is the Democratic primaries. As you can see, was done in 5 different states this past 2020. Now, ranked choice voting, to the best of my knowledge, has been used since 1918, maybe before that, but at least we know it was used in Australia in 1918 and other countries. So this has been proven not just here, but all around the world. And as I mentioned earlier, New York City approved in 2019 to go to ranked choice voting. In fact, they've already conducted primaries with it. But what's interesting, it was approved by the voters there by a 3-to-1 margin. 3-to-1. They saw that this was a better way to do it. And this past November, Alaska became the second state, Maine being the first, that passed, right, not just ranked choice voting, but they took it another step. They call it, it's actually can be called Final Four voting, where you can see Alaska voters just passed open primaries. That's what they call it. Other people call it, and I prefer to call it nonpartisan primaries, together with ranked choice voting and something called dark money disclosure. So let me just mention here what they did in Alaska is they got rid of partisan primaries. Right? We have partisan primaries here in Georgia. Sometimes in Georgia, we call them open primaries because you don't have to be a registered Democrat or a registered Republican to participate. You can show up at the polls and decide which primary you want to vote on. Open primaries, what they decide to do in Alaska going forward is there's going to be one primary. And there'll be Republicans there. There'll be Democrats there. Maybe there'll be independents, maybe other parties, who knows? The top 4 will then go to a general election, and that will be decided by ranked choice voting. There's another organization which is working nationally, one of the ones I mentioned earlier, the Institute for Political Innovation, which is advocating not 4, but 5. So this is a permutation of ranked choice voting. So Alaska, right? It's a good thing it starts with an A. Hopefully we'll get to G soon. Now, lots of people would ask me this incredible important question. Why focus on instant runoff ranked choice voting when there are other election reforms that are needed? And I don't deny that there are. Right? And I'm not telling you here whether, and you can think of them, things that are important. But as you think of them, whether there are things like, for example, some people would like to abolish the Electoral College. Some people are working hard to basically make sure that our districting is done in a nonpartisan fashion, get rid of gerrymandering. Other people want to get rid of how we finance campaigns or change how we finance campaigns. I'm not here to say that's a good thing or bad thing or to advocate for them. What I can say is if you look at each and every one of those things, whether they may not be on the surface partisan, if you look at the reality, it seems like one camp or the other is against them. What we know about ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting, is that it is possible because, as you can see that bridge on the right, there's a bridge between the blue and the red because it is nonpartisan. So how will it happen? Well, it can happen on various levels. There is, as I'm sure you know, you've heard of HR 1, which has been introduced in the House of Representatives. But you may not know that part of that HR 1 Act includes, right, ranked choice voting. It includes it, among many other things. Will it pass the Senate or will it pass the House of Representatives? I'm not sure, but our focus is here in Georgia. Now, because Georgia already has runoffs, which I think you all know because we go to the polls over and over again, we already understand the value of majority winners. Of course, that's not the case for presidential elections and primaries, as I mentioned at the beginning. There is a bill that, well, at Georgia HB 59, which was going to institute instant runoff voting for overseas citizens and military personnel. That's what we have in some neighboring states. It was initially introduced bipartisan. Actually, I should have had the Republican first, but that starts with an R as opposed to the Democrat. Right? It had actually a few Democrat supporters, although the initial sponsor of the bill was Republican Wes Cantrell. Unfortunately, that bill does not stand on its own. It got rolled into the omnibus bill that includes all sorts of other things having to do with voting, and therefore its Democratic support is probably not going to happen. So we don't know what's going to happen there altogether. It would have been great if it could have stood on its own, and I'm pretty sure it would have passed, and that would have been a great first step. It may happen that in Georgia, it's going to start locally. But ranked choice voting does not currently conform to Georgia voting law. Unless an election is decided by simple plurality, and that is an option, state law requires runoff elections between the top two candidates when no candidate receives more than 50% of the votes. That will be true until enabling legislation is passed by Georgia General Assembly, allowing local authorities the option of voting using ranked choice voting. Johns Creek did it more than a year ago, right? They passed a resolution. They could not decide to do it. They passed a resolution, right, urging the Georgia legislature to change the law to allow home rule in this regard. The city of Atlanta just did it a few months ago. The same thing. They passed a resolution, right, asking the legislature to give them the right to conduct their elections as they see fit using ranked choice voting. So let's take a quick look here. Hopefully this will work, and see how you chose your ranked choice voting. Actually, I didn't need to do that, but give me just a second here. Give me just a second here. Okay, give me just a second. I'm going to go back to share my screen again. And hopefully you can see this. Well, you get the results. All right. Here we have, all right, round one. Well, in round one, your polarity had it for bananas. All right. Grapes were second, and splits between orange, pears, and apples. But let's take a look at round two. Well, round two goes into the lead, but far from a majority, only 32%. So pear and orange, apple got eliminated. So apple's votes went to the other folks, the other fruits. Orange got some, banana got some, grapes got some. And I guess did pear get one? I'm not quite sure, but let's look at round three. Well, pear got eliminated. Grapes is still out in the lead, but no, still not a majority. It took till 4 rounds. And finally, grapes squeaks it out over banana. So that's where it works. But hopefully, more importantly than that, you got to see how it actually works. So that let me go back, if I may, and hopefully share my screen to conclude here. All right. So the benefits, again, more choices that are truly representative of voter preferences. Majority winners with true election mandates from the voters. Voting for your first without fear of the worst. And you know that's got to be true because it rhymes. Greater participation in the democratic process with a more engaged and educated electorate. More campaign civility and less negative campaigning that appeals to just a candidate's base. And saving of taxpayers' money and saving of voters' time. So, better Ballot Georgia. We're here, and you can be part of the solution. As I said right at the beginning, we officially launched back in November. Since then, we've been growing in the number of people that are part of our network. As you can see here, we want you to be part of our network. You can sign up to do that. You can go to our website, or we'll contact you to do that. All right. We've raised some money. We're not soliciting money now, but as you can see here, we've We raised a lot of money at our launch, but we're slowly but surely raising more money as we move forward, because it'll take us to some money to get where we need to go. What makes it all happen with Better Ballot Georgia are the following teams. And I mentioned this because in just a moment, you're going to see a link in the chat. If you're interested in volunteering for Better Ballot Georgia, and you feel like maybe you fit into one of these teams, you can indicate what team that perhaps you might fit into. Well, you don't have to right now decide what team, because there'll be an option that says, well, I want to be involved, but I don't know how. There's social research, social outreach, and volunteer onboarding, fundraising, endorsements. That's getting other organizations. And if you're interested in becoming a speaker, hopefully you could do a better job than I can be. I did tonight. You can get involved in our active policy and research team. Social media, right? We do have a Facebook platform. We post on Twitter as well. Our technology infrastructure, which really keeps everything going. We have an arts and media team. As you saw, our logo, which was determined by our arts and media team from input to the entire organization. And we have a messaging team, which worked on this presentation collectively and works on all the messages that come out of Better Ballot Georgia. So would you consider becoming a Better Ballot Georgia volunteer? Well, here is the link. And if Daniel doesn't post it right now into the chat, I'll post it right now. You can do it. And again, I'm Shai Rapkin, that you can reach me at admin@betterjobabougeorgia.org.